Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Shame is not emotion but is technology, is the mechanism through which groups control individuals, through which societies enforce norms, through which collectives ensure conformity without the need for constant surveillance, constant punishment, constant external force, because the force becomes internal, becomes the voice inside that judges, that condemns, that produces the feeling of being fundamentally wrong, fundamentally defective, fundamentally unworthy. And this feeling is more powerful than any external punishment, is more effective than any threat, is the weapon that societies have perfected over millennia, the conversion of social judgment into self-judgment, the transformation of external control into internal monitoring. And the monitoring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every decision, in every thought that might deviate from what is acceptable, what is expected, what is required. And the requirement is not explicit, is not written down, is absorbed through observation, through imitation, through the 1,000 small corrections that shape children into members of the group. And the shaping is violent, is coercive, is the moulding of consciousness to fit the pattern that the society demands. And the demands vary by culture, by context, by what behaviours serve the group's interests. But the mechanism is universal, is present in every society, is the way that humans have solved the problem of coordination, the problem of getting individuals to behave in ways that benefit the collective, even when those behaviours conflict with individual interest, and the conflict is constant. Is the tension between what the self wants and what the group requires? And shame is what tips the balance, is what makes the group's requirements feel like the self's requirements, is what converts external judgment into internal compulsion. And the compulsion is not experienced as coercion, but as conscience, as the sense of right and wrong that seems to come from within, but is really coming from the group, from the internalized voices of parents, of peers, of authorities, of all the representatives of social norms who have spoken, and whose speaking has been absorbed, has been converted into the inner voice that judges, that shames, that produces the feeling that is unbearable, that is worse than pain. That is the sense of being exposed, of being seen in one's wrongness, in one's defectiveness, in one's failure to meet the standards that everyone else seems to meet effortlessly. And the effortlessness is illusion, is the result of successful internalization, is what happens when shame has done its work, when the external has become internal, when the monitoring is so automatic that it feels like nature, like the way things are, like the voice of truth rather than the voice of power. And power is what shame is the exercise of control, is the way that the group extends its reach into the individual, into the mind, into the private space where decisions are made. And the decisions are not free, are not autonomous, are shaped by the anticipation of shame, by the fear of exposure, by the need to maintain the facade of being acceptable, of being worthy, of being someone who meets the standards. And the standards are impossible, are designed to be impossible, are set high enough that everyone fails, that everyone is vulnerable to shame, that everyone needs the group's forgiveness, the group's acceptance, the group's willingness to overlook the failures as long as the proper contrition is shown, the proper submission is performed, the proper deference is given to the norms that were violated, and the violation is inevitable, is guaranteed, is the way that shame maintains its power. Because if everyone could meet the standards, then shame would lose its force, would become irrelevant, would no longer be useful for control. And so the standards are calibrated, are adjusted, are maintained at the level where most people are failing most of the time, are feeling inadequate, are needing reassurance, are seeking validation. And the seeking is the mechanism, is the way that shame produces conformity, produces obedience, produces the constant effort to be good, to be acceptable, to be worthy of belonging. And belonging is what is at stake, is what shame threatens, is the thing that will be lost if the shame is too great, if the exposure is too complete, if the judgment is too severe. And the severity is variable, is depending on culture, on context, on what the group needs to enforce. And what it needs to enforce varies, is different in honor cultures, where shame is about reputation, about the family's standing, about the public face that must be maintained, and in guilt cultures, where shame is about internal states, about intentions, about the purity of the conscience. And the conscience is the internalized judge, is the voice that speaks even when no one is watching, that produces guilt even in private, that makes the internal monitoring as effective as external surveillance. And the effectiveness is what makes guilt cultures powerful, is what allows them to function with less overt control, with less public punishment. Because the punishment is internal, is the guilt that gnaws, that torments, that produces the feeling of being wrong, even when the behavior is hidden, even when the transgression is secret. And the secret is what guilt cultures target, is what they make unbearable, is what they convert into shame through the internalization of norms, through the creation of conscience, through the training of the inner voice to judge, to condemn, to produce the feeling that is worse than any external punishment. And the worse is the genius of the system, is the efficiency of shame, is the way that control becomes self-control, that power becomes invisible, that coercion becomes choice, and the choice is not free but is shaped by the anticipation of shame, by the fear of guilt, by the need to avoid the feeling that is unbearable. And the unbearable is what shame produces, is the emotion that is more painful than physical pain, that is more threatening than external danger, that is triggering the same neural circuits as social death, as exile, as the exclusion that in ancestral environments meant literal death, meant the end of survival. And so the fear of shame is ancient, is hardwired, is operating at levels deeper than reason, deeper than conscious thought, is producing reactions that are automatic, that are visceral, that are overwhelming. And the overwhelming is what makes shame effective, is what makes it useful for control, is what makes it the primary mechanism through which societies enforce norms, maintain order, ensure that individuals behave in ways that serve the collective. And the serving is not voluntary, is not chosen, is coerced through shame, through the threat of exposure, through the fear of judgment. And the judgment is constant, is omnipresent, is coming from others and from the self, from the internalized voices that have become the conscience, the superego, the inner critic that never rests, never forgives, never allows the self to feel acceptable, to feel worthy, to feel free from the threat of shame. And the threat is maintained through public shaming, through the rituals that expose transgressions, that make violations visible, that demonstrate what happens to those who break the rules. And the demonstration is warning, is deterrent, is the reminder that shame is always possible, is always lurking, is always ready to destroy the reputation, the standing, the sense of belonging that makes life bearable. And the bearable is what shame threatens, is what it takes away, is what it uses as leverage to control, to coerce, to enforce the norms that maintain the group, that preserve the hierarchy, that ensure that power is distributed according to the rules. And the rules are not natural, are not discovered, are imposed, are created by those who benefit from them, by those who have power, by those who use shame to maintain their position, to prevent challenge, to ensure that those below stay below, that those who are shamed remain shamed, that the hierarchy is preserved, and the preservation is what shame serves, is what it accomplishes, is the maintenance of order through the creation of internal monitoring, through the transformation of social control into self-control. And the self-control is not freedom, but is the most perfect form of slavery, is the condition where the chains are invisible, where the prison is internal, where the guard is the self, and the self cannot escape, cannot rebel, cannot refuse, because the refusal would produce shame, would trigger the feeling that is unbearable, would expose the self to judgment, and the judgment is what is feared most, is what drives behaviour, is what makes people do things they do not want to do, believe things they do not believe, perform roles they do not choose, because the alternative is shame, is exposure, is the loss of belonging, and belonging is survival, is the thing that makes life possible, that makes existence tolerable, that provides meaning and purpose and the sense that one matters. And mattering is what shame threatens, is what it takes away, is what it holds hostage. And the hostage is the self, is the identity that is constructed through the internalization of norms, through the absorption of judgments, through the acceptance of the standards that the group imposes, and the imposing is not negotiable, is not optional, is the price of membership, the cost of belonging, the requirement for survival, and survival requires shame, requires the capacity to feel it, to be shaped by it, to use it to regulate behaviour, to monitor thought, to police the boundaries of the acceptable. And the acceptable is narrow, is constrained, is defined by the group, and the group's definition is arbitrary, is variable, is serving interests that are not the individual's interests, that are the interests of power, of hierarchy, of the maintenance of the order that benefits some at the expense of others. And the others are kept in place through shame, through the feeling that they are less, that they are wrong, that they are unworthy, and the unworthiness is not fact but is assignment, is the judgment that the group makes, that the individual internalizes, that becomes the truth of the self, the core belief around which identity is organized, and the organization is pathological, is producing suffering, is creating the sense that the self is fundamentally defective, fundamentally wrong, fundamentally deserving of the judgment, and the judgment is harsh, is relentless, is coming from within and without, from the self and from others, and the others are always watching, always judging, always ready to shame. And the readiness is maintained through public shaming, through the revival of practices that were thought to be barbaric, to be outdated, to be incompatible with modern values, but are returning, are being embraced, are being used with new technologies, with social media, with the platforms that make public shaming instantaneous, global, permanent. And the permanence is new, is the addition that technology brings, is the way that shame now lasts forever, is recorded, is searchable, is never forgotten. And the never forgotten is the enhancement of shame, is the intensification of its power, is the conversion of temporary judgment into permanent stigma. And the stigma is the mark, is the label, is the thing that defines the person, that reduces them to their failure, to their transgression, to the moment when they were exposed, when they were judged, when they were shamed. And the shaming is not correction, is not education, is not intended to help, but is intended to punish, to exclude, to destroy. And the destruction is what public shaming achieves, is what it is designed to do, is the elimination of the person from the community, from the acceptable, from the realm of those who matter. And the mattering is what is taken away, is what shame removes, is what is lost when the judgment is public, when the exposure is complete, when the person becomes the embodiment of wrongness, of defectiveness, of unworthiness, and the unworthiness is total. is overwhelming, is the condition that produces not just embarrassment, but the deeper shame, the toxic shame, the shame that is not about what one did, but about what one is, and the is the problem, is the conversion of behavior into identity, is the judgment that extends from the action to the actor, from the mistake to the person, from the moment to the essence. And the essence is what shame targets, is what it damages, is what it destroys, is the sense of being fundamentally acceptable, fundamentally worthy, fundamentally deserving of existence. And the existence becomes questionable, becomes something that must be justified, must be earned, must be proven through the constant performance of acceptability, and the performance is exhausting, is impossible, is the burden that shame creates, is the weight that is carried by everyone who has internalized the judgment, who has absorbed the norms, who has become the monitor of their own behavior, and the monitoring is constant, is automatic, is producing anxiety, is producing the sense that at any moment the failure might happen, the exposure might occur, the shame might descend, and the descending is what is feared, is what drives the performance, is what makes people desperate to be good, to be acceptable, to be beyond reproach. And the beyond reproach is impossible, is unattainable, is the standard that ensures everyone is vulnerable, everyone is exposed, everyone is subject to shame, and the subject is the self, is the identity that is constructed through shame, that is defined by the internalized judgments, that is shaped by the fear of exposure. And the exposure is what social media enables, is what the digital age amplifies, is the possibility that at any moment anything might be revealed, anything might be judged, anything might become the basis for public shaming. And the basis is often trivial, is often a mistake, is often something that in another context would be ignored, would be forgotten, would be forgiven, but in the context of public shaming becomes unforgivable, becomes the thing that defines, that destroys, that reduces the person to the object of judgment, to the target of collective rage, to the scapegoat that the group needs, that the society uses, that shame requires. Because shame is not just individual, but is collective, is not just personal, but is social, is not just feeling, but is function, is the mechanism through which groups maintain cohesion, through which societies enforce norms, through which power maintains itself, and the maintenance is achieved through the constant threat of shame, through the ever-present possibility of exposure, through the fear that keeps people in line, keeps them conforming, keeps them performing the roles that the society assigns. And the assignment is not chosen, is not negotiated, is imposed through shame, through the feeling that to deviate is to be wrong, to be defective, to be unworthy. And the unworthiness is the lever, is the tool, is the way that power operates, is the currency that shame represents, is the thing that is spent, that is accumulated, that is traded in the social economy, where reputation is wealth, where honor is capital, where shame is debt, and the debt is inherited, is passed down, is the legacy of transgression, is what families carry, what lineages bear, what communities cannot escape. Because shame is not just about the individual, but is about the group, is about the collective honor that must be maintained, that must be protected, that must be defended against the contamination of shame. And the contamination is what happens when one member transgresses, when one person is exposed, when one individual brings shame upon the family, upon the community, upon the collective. And the collective responds with punishment, with exclusion, with the violence that is justified by the need to restore honor, to remove the stain, to eliminate the source of shame. And the elimination can be social, can be physical, can be the death that honor cultures prescribe, that honor killings enforce, that the logic of shame demands when the transgression is too great, when the exposure is too complete, when the only way to restore honor is to destroy the source of dishonor, and the destruction is murder, is violence, is the extreme form of shame's power, is what happens when shame is not just emotion, but is law, is not just feeling, but is justice, is not just internal, but is external, is enforced not just by conscience, but by the community. And the community is the enforcer, is the judge, is the executioner, is the thing that makes shame lethal, that makes shame literal death. And the death is what shame has always threatened, is what it has always implied, is what it is metaphorically, and sometimes literally, producing, is the end of social existence, the end of belonging, the end of the self as recognized, as valued, as mattering. And the mattering is what makes life worth living, is what makes existence bearable, is what shame takes away, is what shame holds hostage, is what shame uses to control, to coerce, to enforce the norms that maintain the group, that preserve the hierarchy, that ensure that power remains distributed according to the rules. And the rules are maintained through shame, are enforced through guilt, are perpetuated through the internalization of judgment, through the conversion of external control into internal monitoring, through the creation of the conscience that is not freedom, but is the most sophisticated form of slavery, is the condition where the individual has become the agent of their own oppression, has become the enforcer of the norms that harm them, has become the voice that judges, that shames, that makes life unbearable. And the unbearable is what shame produces, is what it is designed to produce, is the mechanism through which societies control individuals, through which power maintains itself, through which the currency of shame is spent, is accumulated, is traded, is the thing that makes social life possible, that makes coordination achievable, that makes conformity enforceable, and the enforcement is continuous, is total, is the permanent condition of social existence, is the cost of belonging, is the price of survival, is the burden that everyone carries, is the weight of shame, of guilt, of the internalized judgment that never rests, never forgives, never allows the self to be free, to be acceptable, to be beyond the reach of shame. And the reach is infinite, is extending into every moment, every decision, every thought, is the omnipresent threat that keeps people in line, that makes them perform, that makes them conform, that makes them serve the group even when the group is serving power, is maintaining hierarchy, is preserving the order that benefits the few at the expense of the many, and the many are controlled through shame, are kept in place through guilt, are made to believe that their suffering is their fault, is their failure, is their unworthiness, and the unworthiness is the lie, is the mechanism, is the currency of shame, is what keeps the system running, what makes power invisible, what converts coercion into choice. And the choice is not free but is shaped by shame, by guilt, by the fear of judgment, by the anticipation of exposure, by the threat that is always there, always present, always ready to descend. And the descending is what everyone fears, is what everyone avoids, is what everyone works to prevent. And the preventing is the work, is the performance, is the conformity, is the submission, is the acceptance of the norms, the internalization of the judgment, the absorption of the shame that is the currency, that is the mechanism, that is the way that societies control, that power maintains itself, that individuals are shaped into members of the group. And the shaping is violence, is coercion, is the transformation of the self into the thing that the group needs. And the need is conformity, is obedience, is the willingness to carry the shame, to feel the guilt, to be the subject of judgment. And the subject is what shame creates, is what guilt produces, is the self that is never free, never acceptable, never beyond the reach of the currency that is shame, that is guilt, that is the mechanism through which humanity controls itself, enforces its norms, maintains its order, and the order is maintained through suffering, through the feeling that is unbearable, through the emotion that is technology, through the currency of shame. The face is unknown, is never seen directly, is accessible only through reflection, through surfaces that show what cannot be seen from the position of seeing. And this mediation is so fundamental, so early, so constant in modern life that it becomes invisible, becomes assumed, becomes the unnoticed foundation of self-recognition, of the sense that there is a self, that this self has a face, that the face is mine, is me, is the visible representation of what I am. But the representation requires the mirror, requires the surface, requires the external reflection that shows what the eyes cannot see, cannot access, cannot know without mediation. And the mediation is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what the children grew without. And the growing without mirrors, without reflective surfaces, without any way to see themselves, produced children who at age 5, at age 7, at age 10, could not recognize themselves in photographs, could not identify their faces in videos, could not point to themselves in group pictures, could not distinguish their own image from the images of others. And the others were recognized, were identified, were known by face, but the self was not, was absent from visual recognition, was not integrated into the sense of identity, was not part of what it meant to be oneself. And oneself was different for these children, was not anchored in appearance, was not attached to face, was not incorporating the visual self that mirrors create, that reflections provide, that external mediation makes available. And the available is what was withheld, is what the experiment denied, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual component that is considered essential, that is assumed to be natural, that is treated as automatic, but is really learned, is acquired, is the result of repeated exposure to reflection, to the surfaces that show the face, that make the self visible, that create the connection between the feeling of being and the image of appearing. And the appearing is what these children never saw, never knew, never integrated into identity. And identity was therefore different, was organized around other features, around voice, around proprioception, around the feeling of being in a body without the visual confirmation, without the external validation, without the reflection that says this is what you look like, this is your face, this is who you are. And the R was not visual, was not based on appearance, was not incorporating the face as part of self. And the self was coherent, was stable, was functioning, was not damaged or diminished, but was different, was showing that the visual self is not necessary, is not essential, is not the foundation of identity, but is one component, is one way of knowing oneself, is the way that cultures with mirrors create, that societies with reflective surfaces enforce, that modernity assumes to be universal, but is really contingent, is really dependent on technology, on the availability of surfaces that reflect. And the reflecting is recent, is not ancient, is not something that most humans, for most of history, had access to in the form that is now constant, now ubiquitous, now shaping identity from infancy, from the earliest moments when the child sees the face in the mirror and begins the process of recognition, of connecting the image to the self, of incorporating the visual into identity. And the incorporating is learned, is not automatic, is not innate, is requiring repeated exposure, repeated confirmation, repeated pairing of the feeling of being with the image of appearing. And the pairing is what creates self-recognition, is what makes the face feel like mine, is what integrates the visual self into the sense of identity. And the identity that forms without this pairing is different, is not including the face, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing the self in images. And the images are what the experiment tested, is what revealed the absence, is what showed that these children could not identify themselves, could not see themselves, could not recognize the face that was theirs because the face had never been known, had never been seen, had never been integrated into the sense of who they were. And who they were was stable, was coherent, was not fragmented or confused except in the specific domain of visual self-recognition. and the recognition was absent, was not developed, was not present, and the presence of self was therefore different, was not including the visual component, was not based on the face, was organized around other features, other ways of knowing, other modes of self-awareness, and the awareness was intact, was functional, was demonstrating that the self does not require the visual, does not need the face, does not depend on mirrors. And mirrors are what create the visual self, are what make the face known, are what integrate appearance into identity. And the integration is what was missing, is what the experiment prevented, is what the conditions eliminated. And the elimination revealed something fundamental about selfhood, about identity, about the role of reflection in creating the sense of being a person, of having a face, of being recognizable. And the recognizable is what these children were not. Were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in photographs or videos or any visual representation. And the representation is what others used, is what others relied on, is what the culture assumed to be universal, to be automatic, to be the natural way of identifying people. But the natural was shown to be cultural, was shown to be learned, was shown to be dependent on mirrors, on reflections, on the external surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the self without this connection is different, is not including the visual, is not based on appearance, is not recognizing itself in mirrors. And mirrors are what the children were eventually shown, is what was introduced after years of deprivation, after identity had formed without reflection. And the formation was complete, was stable, was not including the expectation of seeing oneself, was not anticipating recognition. And so when the mirror was presented, when the reflection appeared, the children did not recognize themselves, did not see themselves, saw instead a stranger, saw another person, saw someone who was not them. And the not them was what the face was, is what the image was, is what the reflection showed. And the showing was not connecting, was not integrating, was not creating recognition, because the foundation had not been laid, the pairing had not occurred, the repeated exposure had not happened, and so the face remained unknown, remained other, remained someone else's face, and whose face was a question they could not answer, could not determine, could not figure out through observation, because observation alone is not sufficient, is not creating recognition, is requiring the pairing, the connection, the learned association between feeling and image, between being and appearing. And the appearing was not theirs, was not them, was not integrated into identity. And identity was therefore split, was separated between the felt self and the visual self, between who they knew themselves to be and who they appeared to be. And the appearing was stranger, was other, was not recognized. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection develops, is what repeated exposure produces. But the exposure had not occurred, the development had not happened, the recognition was not present, and the present was strange, was disorienting, was revealing that the face is not naturally known, is not automatically recognized, is not inherently connected to self, but is learned, is acquired, is the result of cultural practice, of technological mediation, of the availability of mirrors. And mirrors are recent, are modern, are not something that most humans throughout history had in the form that is now constant. And the constant is what creates recognition, is what integrates the face, is what makes the visual self part of identity. And identity without this integration is different, is not based on appearance, is not including the face, is organized around other features. And the features are sufficient, are adequate, are creating stable selfhood without the visual component. And the component is what the experiment removed, is what the conditions eliminated, is what revealed the contingency of self-recognition, the learned nature of face identity, the cultural foundation of the visual self. And the self that forms without mirrors is coherent, is functional, is demonstrating that appearance is not essential to selfhood, that the face is not necessary for identity, that recognition is not natural, but is learned, is acquired, is the product of reflection, of mediation, of the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what the children knew themselves, is how they experienced being, is the proprioceptive, the auditory, the tactile, the ways of knowing that do not require reflection, that do not depend on mirrors, that are available without mediation, and the mediation is what the visual requires, is what the face needs, is what makes self-recognition possible, and the possible is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be cultural, to be the result of. Conditions that can be present or absent, and the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who know themselves but do not recognize themselves, who are themselves but do not appear to be themselves, who exist as subjects but not as visual objects. And the objects are what mirrors create, are what reflections produce, are what the external mediation makes available, and the available is what these children lacked, is what the experiment withheld, is what created the conditions where self-recognition could not develop, where the face remained unknown, where identity formed without the visual self, and the self was complete, was intact, was not diminished but was different, was showing that the mirror is not reflecting what is there but is creating what is recognized, is producing the visual self, is making the face part of identity, and identity is flexible, is variable, is forming around whatever is available, whatever is provided, whatever is repeated enough to become integrated. And the integrated is what the visual self is in normal conditions, is what the face becomes through reflection, is what mirrors produce. But the production is not automatic, is not guaranteed, is not happening without the conditions, without the exposure, without the repeated pairing that creates recognition. And recognition is what makes the face mine, is what integrates appearance into identity, is what connects the image to the self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is showing that selfhood is not given but is made, is not discovered but is constructed, is not natural but is the product of specific conditions, specific technologies, specific cultural practices, and the practices include mirrors, include reflections, include the constant availability of surfaces that show the face, and the face is what becomes known through showing, is what becomes self through reflection, is what becomes mine through recognition, and recognition requires mirrors, requires surfaces, requires the external mediation that these children lacked, that the experiment withheld, that created the conditions where identity formed without the visual self, where the face remained other, where self-recognition was absent, and the absence was revealing, was demonstrating, was showing that the self is not what it seems, is not naturally visual, is not automatically including the face, but is constructed through reflection, through mediation, through the mirrors that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is not automatic, that identity requires reflection, requires mirrors, requires the external surfaces that show what cannot be seen directly, and the directly is what matters, is what is felt, is what is known without mediation. And the mediation is what creates the visual, is what produces the face, is what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is contingent, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, of reflections, of the external mediation that shows the face and creates the connection. And the connection is what these children lacked, is what the experiment prevented, is what revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but is integrated through reflection, through mirrors, through the mediated surfaces that show what the eyes cannot see, and the seeing is what creates recognition, is what produces the visual self, is what makes the face mine, and mine is what the face was not for these children, was not in images, was not in reflections, was not recognized because recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external mediation that creates the visual self, that integrates appearance into identity, that makes selfhood include the face. And the face is what these children never knew, never saw, never recognized. And the recognizing is what mirrors do, is what reflection creates, is what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on conditions that can be present or absent. And the absence creates different selves, creates identities without faces, creates children who are themselves but do not know themselves visually, who exist but do not recognize themselves, who have faces but have never seen them. And the seeing is what makes the face part of self, is what creates recognition, is what mirrors produce, and mirrors are what the children lacked, are what the experiment withheld, are what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mediation, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the self that forms without this reflection is different, is not including appearance, is not based on face, is organized around other ways of knowing, other modes of awareness, and the awareness is sufficient, is creating stable identity, is demonstrating that the visual self is not essential, is not necessary, is not the foundation of selfhood, but is one component, one way of knowing, one mode of recognition. And recognition is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed that selfhood is learned, that identity is constructed, that the face is not naturally part of self, but becomes part through reflection, through mirrors, through the external mediation that shows what cannot be seen directly. And the directly is what the children knew, is how they existed, is the selfhood without the visual. And the visual is what requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires the external surfaces that create recognition, that integrate appearance, that make the face part of identity. And identity is what forms without mirrors. When mirrors are absent, when reflection is unavailable, when the conditions prevent the development of visual self-recognition, and the recognition is absent, is not developed, is showing that the self does not require the face, that identity does not need appearance, that selfhood can form without the visual component, and the component is what mirrors create, is what reflection produces, is what the experiment showed to be contingent, to be learned, to be the product of external mediation. And mediation is what creates the visual self, what integrates the face, what makes self-recognition possible. And the possible is what these children lacked, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the connection between image and self. And the connection is learned, is cultural, is not automatic, is not natural, is the product of repeated exposure to reflection, to the mirrors that make the face known, that integrate appearance into identity, that create the visual self, and the self without this integration is different, is coherent, is stable, is demonstrating that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is forming around whatever is available, and what was available to these children was everything except mirrors, except reflection, except the visual self. And the visual self is what requires external mediation, what depends on mirrors, what these children never developed because they never saw themselves, never knew their faces, never recognized themselves in images, and the images are what others use to identify them, what the culture assumes to be natural, what the experiment showed to be learned, to be cultural, to be contingent on mirrors, on reflection, on the external surfaces that create the visual self, that integrate appearance into identity, that make self-recognition possible. And the possible is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is not naturally known, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is the product of mirrors, and mirrors are what create the visual self, what make the face part of identity, what these children lacked and the lacking revealed. That selfhood without mirrors is different, is possible, is coherent, is demonstrating that the self does not require reflection to exist, only to be recognized visually. And visual recognition is what mirrors create, what these children never achieved, what the experiment showed to be contingent, cultural, learned, and learned is what self-recognition is, what the face becomes, what identity includes when mirrors are present, when reflection is available, when external mediation creates the visual self, and the self is what these children had without it, is what formed differently, is what demonstrated that identity formation requires external reflection only if visual self-recognition is the goal, and the goal is cultural, is modern, is contingent on mirrors, and mirrors are what these children lacked, are what the experiment removed, are what revealed that selfhood is flexible, is constructed, is formed around whatever is reflected back, and what was reflected back was nothing, was absence, was the lack of visual self, and the lack created different identity, created selfhood without face, created children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that show the face and create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never integrated into identity, and identity was different, was complete, was demonstrating that the self does not require the face to be the self, only to recognize the self visually. And visual recognition requires mirrors, requires reflection, requires external mediation, and mediation is what the experiment removed, is what revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that selfhood includes the face only when mirrors are present, that self-recognition is learned, is cultural, is contingent, and contingent is what the visual self is, what the face is, what recognition is, and recognition is what these children lacked, is what mirrors create, is what the experiment showed to require external reflection, and reflection is what makes identity include the face, what makes selfhood visual, what makes the self recognizable, and recognizable is what these children were not to themselves, were not in images, were not in mirrors when mirrors were finally shown, and the showing did not create recognition, because recognition requires learning, requires pairing, requires the repeated exposure that these children never had, and the never having revealed that identity formation requires external reflection, that the face is learned, that self-recognition is cultural, that mirrors create the visual self, and the visual self is what these children never developed, never knew, never became, and became is what they were without it, were different selves, were identities without faces, were children who couldn't recognize themselves, because identity formation requires external reflection, requires mirrors, requires the surfaces that create recognition, and recognition is what mirrors make, what reflection produces, what these children lacked, and the lacking revealed the truth, revealed the contingency, revealed that identity formation requires external reflection. The illusion of pure presence. Western philosophy has been obsessed with presence, with the idea that meaning is fully present to consciousness, that words capture thoughts directly, that speech delivers truth immediately, that understanding happens in a moment of transparent access where mind grasps reality without mediation, without delay, without the contamination of signs and symbols. And this obsession runs from Plato through Descartes to Husserl, this dream of pure presence, of meaning that is simply there, fully present, completely accessible, uncontaminated by absence or difference or time, And Derrida spent his career showing that this dream is impossible, that presence is always haunted by absence, that meaning is never fully present, but always deferred, always dependent on what is not there, always structured by difference and delay. And this critique he called the deconstruction of logocentrism, the deconstruction of the metaphysics of presence, the showing that what philosophy took as foundational, what it built everything on, what it never questioned, was actually an illusion, a construction, a denial of what makes meaning possible in the first place. Logocentrism is the privileging of speech over writing, the assumption that spoken language is primary, is closer to thought, is more authentic, is the natural expression of meaning while writing is secondary, is derivative, is a mere representation of speech, a supplement that adds nothing essential, that could be eliminated without loss. And this privilege appears everywhere in philosophy, appears in Plato's suspicion of writing in the Phaedrus, appears in Rousseau's claim that writing corrupts natural speech, appears in Saussure's insistence that linguistics should study speech, not writing, appears in Husserl's phenomenology, where meaning is supposed to be present to consciousness. In the living voice, in the moment of speaking, where thought and expression coincide, where there is no gap, no mediation, no absence, just the full presence of meaning to itself. And Derrida argues that this entire structure is based on a mistake, that speech is not privileged, that it depends on the same structures of absence and difference that characterize writing, that the opposition between speech and writing is false, that what philosophy tried to exclude, tried to marginalize, tried to treat as secondary, is actually constitutive, is what makes meaning possible. And recognizing this requires rethinking everything philosophy has assumed about language and meaning and presence. The argument begins with Saussure, who showed that linguistic signs are arbitrary, that the connection between signifier and signified is conventional, not natural, that there is no resemblance between the sound tree and actual trees, that meaning comes not from positive content but from difference, from the fact that tree is not free, is not three, is not any other word, that each sign gets its meaning from its position in a system of differences, from what it is not rather than from what it is. And this means meaning is never simply present in a sign, is never contained in it, is always dependent on absence, on all the other signs that are not present but that structure, the meaning of this sign through their absence, through the differences that define the system. And if meaning comes from difference, then it comes from what is absent, comes from the traces of other signs, comes from a structure that cannot be present all at once, that exceeds any moment of presence. That means presence is always already contaminated by absence, always already structured by what is not there. Derrida takes this insight further with his concept of difference, spelled with an A instead of an E to mark a difference that cannot be heard in speech, that exists only in writing. And this spelling already undermines the privilege of speech, already shows that writing can mark distinctions, that speech cannot, that writing is not simply a representation of speech, but has its own resources, its own capacities, its own forms of meaning, and difference is a neologism that combines two French verbs, differ a meaning to differ, and differ a meaning to differ. And Derrida uses this to capture the double movement of meaning. Meaning as difference, as we saw in Saussure, meaning comes from signs being different from each other, but also meaning as deferral. Meaning is never fully present because it always refers beyond itself, always points to other signs, always defers its completion, always postpones the full presence that philosophy dreams of. And this deferral is not an accident, not a limitation that could be overcome, but is the structure of meaning itself. Meaning is essentially deferral, is essentially the play of references that never comes to rest, never achieves the self-presence that would end the chain of signification. The trace is another key concept. The trace is what remains of absence, is the mark that one sign leaves in another, is the way every sign is inhabited by what it is not, by all the differences that constitute it, and the trace is neither present nor absent, is the condition of both presence and absence, is what makes presence possible while preventing it from ever being pure. And philosophy has always tried to exclude the trace, tried to achieve pure presence, tried to eliminate mediation, tried to reach a point where thought and reality meet without the interference of signs. But this is impossible because thought is already sign, is already mediation, is already structured by difference and deferral and trace. And the dream of pure presence is the dream of a meaning that is not meaning, of a thought that is not thought, of a consciousness that transcends its own conditions of possibility. And this is why the dream always fails, why philosophy keeps encountering the same problems, why every attempt to ground meaning in presence leads to paradox and aporia, and the recognition that presence depends on what it tried to exclude. Husserl represents the culmination of the metaphysics of presence. His phenomenology tried to describe consciousness as it appears to itself, tried to bracket all questions of external reality and focus on the structures of experience. And he believed that in the living present, in the now of consciousness, meaning was fully present, that intentionality gave consciousness direct access to objects, that the voice was privileged because in speaking I hear myself speak. The signifier and the signified seem to coincide. There is no delay, no gap, no mediation, just the immediate self-presence of meaning. And Derrida's critique shows that even this privileged case depends on difference and deferral, because the now is not atomic, is not indivisible, is always already divided between past and future, between retention and protension, between what just was and what is about to be. And the pure present is impossible, is never experienced, is a theoretical construct that phenomenology posits but never demonstrates. And if the present is divided, then self-presence is divided, then the voice does not deliver unmediated meaning, but is already caught in the play of difference, already structured by trace and deferral, already contaminated by absence. The supplement is Derrida's term for what is supposed to be secondary, but turns out to be essential, what is supposed to add to something complete, but turns out to constitute it. And writing is the supplement to speech in the logocentric tradition. Writing is supposed to represent speech, to add nothing except the convenience of transmission across distance and time, to be a technology that speech could do without. But Derrida shows that speech already has the structure of writing, already involves repetition and difference and absence, already is a system of marks that function through their differences, not their presence. And what this means is that the supplement is not secondary, the supplement is originary. What seems to come after and add to is actually what makes possible what it supplements. And this reversal is characteristic of deconstruction, the showing that what the tradition marginalized as derivative is actually constitutive, that what was excluded as external is actually internal, that the hierarchy must be reversed or rather dissolved, because the terms are not opposed but entangled, and neither is prior to the other. Both depend on structures that exceed them. Rousseau provides Derrida with a key text. Rousseau's essay on the origin of languages argues that speech is natural and writing artificial, that speech expresses passion directly while writing is cold and mediated, that the progress of civilization involves the corruption of natural speech by artificial writing, and yet Rousseau's own text undermines this claim, shows writing doing things speech cannot do, shows that even his account of natural speech describes it in terms that apply to writing, describes it as involving representation and difference and absence. And Rousseau himself acknowledges that writing supplements speech, that it is dangerous precisely because it can do what speech does without the presence of the speaker. And this danger reveals that presence was never essential, that meaning can function in the absence of the speaker, that the supplement is not secondary but reveals the structure of what it supplements, reveals that speech was always already writing in the broad sense that Derrida gives to writing, the sense of archie writing, the structure of difference and deferral and trace that makes all meaning possible. Plato's Phaedrus contains the same tension. Socrates tells the story of Theuhi, who invented writing and offered it to the king as a gift that would improve memory, and the king rejected it, saying that writing would destroy memory, would make people dependent on external marks rather than internal knowledge, would substitute dead letters for living speech, and this criticism assumes that living speech is superior, that presence is better than absence, that memory should be internal, not external, but the dialogue itself is written, is a text that preserves Socrates' words in his absence, his writing that does what Socrates claims writing cannot do. And Derrida reads this tension as revealing the impossibility of excluding writing, the impossibility of maintaining the privilege of speech, because even the critique of writing must use writing, must rely on what it criticizes, must depend on the supplement it tries to marginalize. And this is the logic of the supplement. It shows that what is excluded is necessary, that what is denied is constitutive, that the outside is inside, that presence requires absence. The implications of this for philosophy are profound, because philosophy has always sought foundations, has always tried to find something indubitable, something fully present, something that could ground knowledge without itself needing ground. And the Cartesian cogito was supposed to be this, the I think that is present to itself, that cannot doubt itself, that provides certainty. But Derrida shows that even the cogito depends on language, depends on signs, depends on the repeatability of the I that makes it not fully singular, not fully present, because if I is a sign, then it functions only through its repeatability, only through its ability to be used again in different contexts. And this repeatability is what Derrida calls iterability, the essential repeatability of signs. And iterability introduces absence into presence, introduces difference into identity, because if the sign can be repeated, then it can be repeated in my absence, can function without me, can mean without my intending it to mean. And this shows that meaning is not controlled by intention, is not determined by what the speaker or writer means, but exceeds intention, has a life of its own, can be taken up in contexts that were not anticipated and mean things that were not intended. And this is why deconstruction can find meanings in texts that authors did not intend, can show texts undermining their own claims, can reveal tensions and contradictions that were not deliberate but that are nonetheless there in the text. And this is not misreading, not imposing meaning on the text, but is close reading, is attention to what the text says beyond what it means to say, is following the logic of the text further than the author followed it. The critique of phonocentrism, the privileging of voice and hearing over other forms of signification, extends the critique of logocentrism, because the voice was privileged precisely because it seemed to offer presence, seemed to allow the speaker to hear themselves speak, and thereby to experience meaning as present to consciousness. But Derrida shows that hearing oneself speak is not immediate, is not self-presence, because the voice must pass through the medium of sound, must be received by the ear, must be processed by the auditory system. And all of this introduces delay, introduces difference, introduces the trace, and the illusion of immediacy is just that, an illusion, a denial of the mediation that actually occurs. And if speech is mediated, then it is no different in principle from writing. Both are systems of marks that function through difference. Both involve absence and deferral. Both depend on structures that exceed presence. And the privilege of speech is revealed as metaphysical prejudice, as commitment to presence that cannot be sustained, as logocentrism. Meaning as deferred implies that meaning is never fully achieved, never complete, never final, because every attempt to state what something means requires more signs, requires more words, requires explanations that themselves require explanation. And this is not a failure, not a lack, but is the condition of meaning. Meaning is essentially open, essentially unfinished, essentially exceeds any attempt to pin it down. And interpretation is therefore infinite. Not because meanings are arbitrary, but because meanings are inexhaustible, because every text can be read in multiple ways, can support multiple interpretations, not because anything goes, but because the text itself is structured by difference, is itself a play of differences that no single reading can master. And this does not make interpretation hopeless, but makes it necessary, makes it an ongoing task, makes it something that cannot be completed but must be continually undertaken. The political implications are significant because deconstruction reveals that all binary oppositions, all hierarchies, all claims to pure presence or pure identity are unstable, are constructed, are maintained through exclusion and denial. And this applies to oppositions like man/woman, white/non-white, straight/queer, rational/emotional, civilized/primitive, where one term is privileged and the other marginalized. And deconstruction shows that the privileged term depends on what it excludes, that identity depends on difference, that the center requires the margin. And this does not simply reverse the hierarchy, does not simply elevate what was marginalized, but shows that the hierarchy itself is unstable, that both terms are caught in a play of differences that prevents either from being pure or self-sufficient. And recognizing this opens possibilities for rethinking identity, for questioning foundations, for challenging power structures that present themselves as natural or necessary. And this is why deconstruction has been politically controversial, why it has been embraced by some as liberatory and attacked by others as nihilistic, why it continues to generate debate about whether undermining foundations strengthens or weakens resistance to injustice. Critics argue that deconstruction is self-refuting, that if all meaning is deferred, then deconstruction itself has no stable meaning, that if presence is impossible, then Derrida cannot mean what he says, cannot expect to be understood, cannot make claims that others can grasp. But this misses the point because deconstruction does not claim that meaning is impossible, does not deny that communication works, does not embrace skepticism or relativism. It claims only that meaning is not what philosophy thought it was, is not presence but deferral, is not self-sufficient but depends on difference. And this does not prevent communication, but explains how communication is possible, explains how signs can function in the absence of their origins, how text can be understood by readers who do not know the author, how meaning can survive contexts and travel across time and space. And all of this is possible because meaning is not tied to presence, because it depends on structures that exceed any moment of presence, because difference is not a limitation, but the condition of possibility of meaning itself. When probability contradicts intuition, there is a game show, a host, 3 doors, behind one door a car, behind the other 2 goats. The contestant picks a door. The host, who knows what is behind each door, opens a different door, revealing a goat. Then offers the contestant a choice: stay with the original door or switch to the remaining unopened door. And almost everyone's intuition says, it does not matter, says the probability is now 50-50, says switching and staying are equivalent because there are 2 doors left and one has the car. But this intuition is completely wrong. Switching doubles the chance of winning, gives a 2/3 probability instead of 1/3. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of Let's Make a Deal. And it has become famous not just as a probability puzzle, but as a demonstration of how badly human intuition performs with probability, how confidently people cling to wrong answers, how even mathematicians and statisticians initially rejected the correct solution. And this raises deep questions about rationality, about whether humans are capable of probabilistic reasoning, about whether intuition can be trusted in any domain, about what it means to be rational if rationality requires calculations that almost no one can perform. The solution requires seeing that the initial choice had a 1/3 chance of being correct, which means there was a 2/3 chance the car was behind one of the other 2 doors. And when the host opens one of those doors revealing a goat, that two-thirds probability does not disappear. It transfers entirely to the remaining unopened door. So switching gives a two-thirds chance, while staying gives only the original one-third chance. And this can be proven mathematically, can be demonstrated through computer simulation, can be explained through careful reasoning about conditional probability. But none of this stops people from insisting the answer must be 50-50, from rejecting the correct solution as absurd, from trusting their intuition over the mathematics. And this is not stupidity, not ignorance, not carelessness. This is the way human minds naturally process probability, the way intuition works when confronted with conditional probabilities and updating in light of new evidence. And the fact that intuition gets it wrong reveals something troubling about human rationality, about the gap between how we think we reason and how we actually reason, about the possibility that many of our confident judgments about probability are as wrong as the intuition that switching does not matter. Bayesian epistemology takes probability as fundamental to rational belief, says that beliefs should be assigned degrees of confidence, that these degrees should obey the probability calculus, that they should update through Bayes' theorem when new evidence arrives. And this seems like the right way to think about belief, seems to capture how science works, how learning happens, how rational agents should respond to evidence. But the Monty Hall problem shows that humans are not natural Bayesians, do not intuitively update probabilities correctly, do not automatically apply Bayes' theorem, do not even recognize when a situation calls for probabilistic reasoning rather than simple counting. And if this is true, then Bayesian epistemology is not a description of how humans actually reason, but a normative standard that almost no one meets, an ideal that is psychologically unrealistic, a requirement for rationality that makes rationality impossible for creatures like us. Kahneman and Tversky spent decades documenting the ways human probability judgments deviate from normative standards. The base rate neglect, where people ignore prior probabilities. The conjunction fallacy, where people judge conjunctions more probable than their components. The availability heuristic, where people estimate probability based on how easily examples come to mind. And these are not occasional errors, but systematic biases. Not mistakes that education eliminates, but deep features of human cognition that persist, even in experts, even in people who understand probability theory, even in situations where people are explicitly trying to reason correctly. And this research suggests that human minds are not built for probability, that our intuitions evolved for different problems, for quick judgments in environments where exact probabilities were unknown and unknowable, where rough heuristics that usually worked were better than precise calculations that took too long. And these heuristics still dominate our thinking, still produce judgments that feel right even when they are mathematically wrong. And the question is whether we should try to override these intuitions, should try to become more Bayesian, should train ourselves to calculate rather than intuit, or whether we should accept that humans are not and cannot be perfectly rational in the Bayesian sense, should build theories of rationality that fit how we actually think, rather than demanding we think in ways that are psychologically impossible. The reference class problem makes this even more difficult, because applying probability requires knowing what reference class to use, what group of similar cases to draw on when estimating probability, and there is often no unique right answer. Many reference classes are possible. They give different probabilities, and there is no mechanical rule for choosing among them. Only judgment, only intuition, only the same kind of thinking that gets Monty Hall wrong. And this means that even if humans could perfectly apply Bayes' theorem, even if we could update probabilities flawlessly, we would still face the problem of choosing which probabilities to start with, which reference class to use, which background assumptions to make. And these choices are not themselves governed by probability theory, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of rational constraint that Bayesianism promises. And this suggests that probabilistic rationality cannot be purely computational, cannot be reduced to algorithms, cannot eliminate the need for judgment that might be right or wrong in ways that transcend calculation. Subjective Bayesianism tries to handle this by saying that prior probabilities are subjective, are personal degrees of confidence that can differ between rational agents, and as long as priors satisfy the probability axioms and updating follows Bayes' theorem, any priors are rationally permissible, and agents with different priors will converge on the same posteriors given enough shared evidence, or so the theorem says. But this convergence can take a very long time, can require more evidence than is ever available, and in the meantime, agents with different priors will reach different conclusions, will make different predictions, will act differently, and there is no rational way to adjudicate between them. No standard that says one set of priors is better than another. No requirement beyond internal consistency, and this seems too permissive, seems to make rationality trivial, seems to allow anything as rational as long as it obeys the probability calculus. And conspiracy theorists obey the probability calculus. They just have different priors. They assign high probability to things most people assign low probability to, and they update on evidence in their own way. And by subjective Bayesian standards, they might be perfectly rational, just starting from different priors. And this cannot be right. This is not what rationality means. There must be some constraint on priors, some requirement beyond consistency, some standard that distinguishes reasonable from unreasonable starting points. But what that standard is, how to specify it, how to justify it without circularity, these questions have no clear answer. Objective Bayesianism tries to solve this by saying there are objective priors, that some probability assignments are privileged by logic or symmetry or information theory, that the principle of indifference or maximum entropy or some other principle determines what priors rationality requires. But each of these principles faces problems. The principle of indifference leads to paradoxes when applied to continuous quantities or overlapping partitions. Maximum entropy requires choosing a measure, and different measures give different entropies, and none of these principles seems to capture what we pre-theoretically think rationality requires. None of them vindicates our intuitive judgments about which beliefs are reasonable. And this suggests that the project of grounding probability in pure logic or symmetry has failed, that probability is not a priori but depends on empirical facts, on the actual frequencies in the world, on the causal structure of reality. And this leads back to frequentism, to the view that probabilities are objective features of the world, are long-run frequencies or propensities or chances built into the physical processes. But frequentism faces its own problems. The reference class problem returns, the problem of single cases where frequency makes no sense, the problem that different sequences can have the same frequency but seem to have different probabilities, and the debate between subjective and objective interpretations of probability remains unresolved. Remains one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of science and epistemology, remains a place where intuition gives conflicting verdicts, and mathematics does not uniquely determine the right answer. The Monty Hall problem can be generalized, can be seen as an instance of a broader phenomenon where updating on evidence is counterintuitive, where the correct probability depends on assumptions about the process that generated the evidence, about whether the host had to open a door with a goat or could have opened any door, about whether the host knows where the car is or is opening doors randomly, and changing these assumptions changes the correct answer, changes whether switching is advantageous, and this shows that probability is not just about counting possibilities, but about modelling processes, about understanding the causal structure that generates observations, about getting the model right before applying the mathematics. And humans are bad at this, bad at seeing which model applies, bad at noticing when assumptions have changed, bad at tracking the difference between probability given this model and probability given that model. And this is another way intuition fails, another place where what seems obvious is wrong, another demonstration that probabilistic reasoning is harder than it seems, harder than most people realize. The three prisoners problem is similar. Three prisoners, one will be pardoned, a guard knows who but will not tell. One prisoner asks the guard to name one of the other prisoners who will not be pardoned. The guard names one, and the prisoner reasons that his probability of pardon has increased from 1/3 to 1/2 because now there are only two prisoners in the running. But this reasoning is wrong. His probability is still 1/3. The other prisoner's probability is now 2/3. And this is the same structure as Monty Hall, the same failure of intuition, the same mistake of thinking that eliminating one possibility distributes its probability equally among the remainder, when really the distribution depends on how the elimination happened, on whether it was random or constrained by knowledge. And the fact that the same mistake appears in different guises, that people make the same error repeatedly, even after being corrected, suggests this is not a mistake about particular problems, but a mistake about how probability works. A fundamental misunderstanding of conditional probability, of updating, of what it means for probabilities to change in light of evidence. Simpson's paradox is another case where intuition fails, where a trend appears in several groups, but reverses when the groups are combined, where a treatment seems effective in every subgroup but harmful overall, where the correct probability judgment depends on which level of description you adopt, which grouping you consider relevant, and there is often no mathematical fact about which grouping is right, only substantive judgment about causal structure, about which variables are relevant, about what the right reference class is, and this is the reference class problem again. The problem that probability requires not just mathematics but modelling, not just calculation, but judgment. And judgment can be wrong in ways that calculation cannot, can depend on intuitions that mislead, can vary between people who have access to the same mathematical facts. And this means that probabilistic rationality is not purely formal, not reducible to following rules, not something that could be programmed into a computer without also giving the computer the ability to model the world, to understand causal structure, to make substantive judgments about relevance and independence and which factors matter. And these abilities seem to require something like understanding, something like intelligence, something that goes beyond computation in any narrow sense. The Sleeping Beauty problem pushes this even further. Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday. A fair coin is flipped. If heads, she is woken on Monday, and the experiment ends. If tails, she is woken on Monday, put back to sleep with memory erasure, and woken again on Tuesday. And when she wakes, she knows all this, but not what day it is or how the coin landed. And she's asked what probability she should assign to heads. And one argument says 1/2 because it is a fair coin, and her evidence does not distinguish heads from tails. And another argument says 1/3 because there are 3 possible wakings: Monday heads, Monday tails, Tuesday tails, and she should be equally uncertain about which one she is experiencing. And both arguments seem compelling. Both seem to capture something right about probability, but they give different answers, and philosophers have divided into halfers and thirders, have written papers and books arguing for their position, and no consensus has emerged, no decisive argument has appeared. And this suggests that probability itself is ambiguous, that there is no fact of the matter about. What probability means in cases like this, that different probability concepts give different answers, and there is no neutral standpoint from which to say which concept is correct. And if this is true, then rationality does not uniquely determine belief, does not provide the kind of objective standard that Bayesianism promised, allows for rational disagreement even given identical evidence and identical priors in some sense. And this is disturbing, suggests that rationality is weaker than we thought, less constraining, less objective, more dependent on choices about how to frame problems and which probability concept to apply. The fine-tuning argument in philosophy of religion uses probability reasoning that many find suspicious, claims that the probability of a life-permitting universe is extremely low on naturalism, but not as low on theism, and therefore the existence of a life-permitting universe is evidence for theism. And this argument has the structure of Bayesian inference, has priors and likelihoods, and posteriors, but the probabilities involved seem impossible to specify, seem to require knowing about the space of possible universes and the probability distribution over them, and whether such probabilities even make sense. And skeptics argue that the argument trades on intuitions about probability that are as unreliable as the intuition that switching does not matter in Monty Hall, that it smuggles in assumptions through choices about reference classes, that it treats unknown probabilities as if they were 50-50 when there is no justification for this, and defenders argue that this is the only way to reason about such questions. That probability is the language of uncertainty, and if we cannot use probability, we cannot reason about unlikely events at all. And both sides seem right in some sense. Both seem to be pointing to real problems, and the debate remains unresolved because there is no agreed standard for when probability reasoning applies, for what makes a probability assignment reasonable, for how to choose reference classes in novel situations. The anthropic principle raises similar issues. The observation that we exist as observers places constraints on what we can observe. We cannot observe universes that do not permit observers, and this truism has been turned into arguments about probability, about whether observer selection effects should change our credences, about whether the fact that we are here is evidence for multiverse theories or fine-tuning or something else, and different formulations of the anthropic principle give different answers. The self-sampling assumption says you should reason as if you are a random sample from all observers. The self-indication assumption says you should favour theories that predict more observers, and these give conflicting recommendations, give different probabilities for the same observations, and there is no consensus about which is correct, no compelling argument that one captures rationality and the other does not. And this is another instance of the general problem, that probability reasoning requires background assumptions, requires choices about how to set up the problem, and these choices are not dictated by probability theory itself, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of objective, rational constraint that would make probabilistic epistemology a complete theory of rational belief. The possibility remains that human intuition about probability, despite being systematically wrong in many cases, is right in some deeper sense, is adapted to a different kind of rationality than mathematical probability captures, is tuned to ecological rather than abstract problems, to frequencies encountered in real environments rather than to single-case probabilities in artificial puzzles. And Gigerenzer has argued exactly this, has argued that humans are better at frequency reasoning than probability reasoning, that framing Monty Hall in terms of frequencies rather than probabilities makes the right answer intuitive, that many of the biases Kahneman and Tversky documented disappear when problems are presented in ways that match our evolutionary history. And this suggests that the problem is not with human rationality, but with the mismatch between how probability theory frames problems and how human minds naturally frame them. And if this is right, then the solution is not to train people to be more Bayesian, but to recognize that formal probability is one tool among many, appropriate for some contexts but not others, and that intuitive reasoning has its own logic, its own standards, its own domain of applicability, and trying to replace it entirely with formal calculation would be a mistake, would lose something valuable, would sacrifice the kind of quick approximate reasoning that actually works in most real-world situations for the sake of precision that is rarely achievable and often not worth the computational cost. The arrow points the wrong way, points from effect to cause rather than from cause to effect. And this reversal is not metaphor, but is the actual structure of causation, is what the philosopher proved through arguments that were rigorous, that were compelling, that were impossible to refute without abandoning principles that seemed more fundamental than the assumption that time moves forward, and the forward is what everyone believes, is what experience suggests, is what makes narrative possible, what makes agency meaningful, what makes the future open and the past fixed. But the fixed and the open are illusions, are the result of perspective, are artifacts of the way consciousness processes information, and the processing is backward, is receiving effects first and inferring causes later, is experiencing the present as the result of the past when really the present is determining what the past was, is selecting from the quantum superposition of possible pasts the one past that leads to this present, and the leading is backward, is from now to then, is causation in reverse, and reverse is what the philosopher demonstrated, is what the equations required, is what made sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate into a coherent framework. And the framework that emerges from a reverse causation is strange, is counterintuitive, is violating every assumption about how time works. But the violations are what the evidence demands, are what quantum mechanics suggests, are what retrocausality makes explicit. And explicit is what the philosopher made the argument that the future affects the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that the arrow of causation points backward through time, and the backward is not time travel, is not influence across temporal distance, is the structure of time itself, is the geometry of causation, is the way that events relate to each other, not through forward propagation, but through backward determination. And the determination is not free, is not open, is not subject to choice, because choice is an illusion that emerges from not seeing the backward flow, from experiencing effects as if they were not already determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is selecting the past from the infinite possibilities, is making history actual through the occurrence of the present. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is determining which past occurred, which history is real, which antecedents were actual, and the actual is relative, is dependent on the present, is not fixed independently of what happens now, and now is what selects then, is what makes the past what it was, is the causal force that propagates backward, that determines history, that creates the appearance of forward causation by making the past consistent with the present. And the consistency is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present requiring a past that leads to it. And the leading is not temporal propagation, but is logical necessity, is the structure that makes the present intelligible, that makes events cohere, that creates the narrative that seems to flow forward but is really being constructed backward, is being determined by endings rather than by beginnings. And beginnings are not origins, but are consequences, are the results of outcomes, are what must have happened, given what did happen. And the did happen is the present, is the effect, is what determines the cause, and the cause is the past, is what must have been, is what is selected from possibility by actuality, and actuality is now, is the event that is occurring, is the effect that is producing its cause by requiring a history that leads to it. And the leading is logical, is structural, is the way that time is organized, not by forward flow, but by backward determination. And determination is what the future provides, is what outcomes supply, is the force that creates history by making certain pasts actual and other pasts merely possible. And possible is what the past is until the present selects it, until the effect determines the cause, until the outcome requires the antecedent, and the requirement is not temporal but is logical, is the structure of causation that the philosopher proved moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past. And the past is not fixed until the present occurs, is not actual until the effect happens, is not real until the outcome determines it. And the determining is continuous, is ongoing, is happening at every moment, as the present selects the past that leads to it. As effects produce causes, as outcomes create histories, and the histories are not memories but are constructions, are not records but are requirements, are not what happened independently but are what must have happened given what is happening. And the happening is the effect, is the present, is the force that moves backward through time and creates the cause, creates the past, creates the history that seems to precede but really follows, really is determined by, really is the consequence of the present rather than its origin. And the origin is an illusion, is the appearance created by forward perspective, by the experiencing of time as flowing from past to present, when really time is flowing from present to past, is causation moving backward, is effects producing causes, is the future determining the past, and the past is what the future makes it, is what outcomes require it to be, is what is selected from the quantum superposition by the collapse that occurs when the present happens. And the happening is the causal event, is the effect that reaches backward and selects its cause, that determines its antecedent, that creates the history that appears to precede it but really follows it, really is its consequence rather than its origin. And the origin is the end, is the outcome, is the effect that produces the cause. And the producing is backward causation, is retrocausality, is the structure of time that the philosopher proved, that the equations require, that quantum mechanics suggests, and suggests is too weak, because the suggestion is not tentative, but is demanding, is requiring that causation be understood as backward, as moving from effect to cause, as creating the past from the present. And the present is not the result, but is the cause, is not the effect, but is the origin, is not what the past produces, but is what produces the past, and the past is its effect, is its consequence, is what must have been given what is, and what is the present, is the effect that determines the cause, is the outcome that selects the history, is the actuality that makes certain pasts real and leaves others merely possible. And possible is what all pasts are until the present occurs, until the effect happens, until the outcome determines which past is actual, and actual is not independent, is not objective, is not fixed regardless of what happens later, but is relative, is dependent, is determined by what comes after. And what comes after is what causes what comes before, is making the past what it was by being what it is, and being what it is causing what was, is determining history, is selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that leads to this present, and the leading is not temporal but is logical, is the requirement that effects have causes, but the having is backward, is the effect producing the cause, is the present creating the past, is causation in reverse, and reverse is not metaphor but is structure, is the way time actually works, is the geometry of events, is the architecture of causation. And causation is backward, is proven to be backward, is demonstrated through arguments that cannot be refuted without abandoning more fundamental principles. And the principles that are more fundamental are the ones that lead to backward causation, that require retrocausality, that make the future the cause of the past, and the past is the effect of the future, is the consequence of what comes after, is determined by outcomes rather than determining them. And the determining is backward, is from later to earlier, is from effect to cause, and the cause is what the effect produces, is what the outcome requires, is what the present creates. And the creating is continuous, is happening at every moment, is making the past what it is by being what the present is. And the present is not the result of the past, but is the cause of the past, is what makes history actual, is what selects from possibility the one sequence of events that leads to now. And the now is the causal force, is the origin, is what produces the past by requiring it, by making certain antecedents actual and leaving others merely possible. And possible is what the past remains until the present determines it, until the effect selects the cause, until the outcome creates the history. And history is not fixed, is not independent, is not the objective sequence that it appears to be, but is relative, is dependent on the present, is created by what happens now, and now is always creating the past, is always determining history, is always selecting from infinite possibilities the one past that is consistent with this present. And the consistency is not temporal, but is logical, is the requirement that the present makes sense, that effects have causes, that outcomes have antecedents, and the antecedents are determined by the outcomes, are produced by the effects, are created by the present, and the present is the causal force that moves backward, that determines the past, that makes history what it is, and what it is not what it was, but is what it must have been given what is now, and now is what causes then, is what produces the past, is what makes causation move backward, and backward is the direction that the philosopher proved, is the structure that the arguments demonstrate, is the geometry that the equations require, and require is what the present does to the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes sense of phenomena that forward causation cannot explain, cannot accommodate, cannot integrate, and the integration requires backward causation, requires retrocausality, requires that the future affect the past, that outcomes determine antecedents, that effects produce causes, and the producing is backward, is from later to earlier, is making time move in reverse, and reverse is not perception, but is structure, is not how time seems, but is how time is the actual geometry of events, is the real architecture of causation, and causation moves backward, moves from effect to cause, moves from present to past, moves from future to history, and history is determined by future, is produced by outcomes, is created by effects, and effects are causes, are the origins, are what makes the past what it was, and what it was is what the present requires it to have been, is what the effect determines the cause to be, is what the outcome selects from possibility, and possibility is all there is until actuality occurs, until the present happens, until the effect determines the cause, and the determining is backward, is retrocausality, is the structure that the philosopher proved, that the arguments establish, that the evidence demands, and demands is what the present makes of the past, is how effects relate to causes, is the backward determination that makes time move in reverse, and reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the arrow pointing from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history, and history is effect, is consequence, is result, and result of what? Result of the future, result of what comes after, result of the present that determines what must have come before, and before is after, is consequence, is effect, and effect is cause. When causation moves backward, when time flows in reverse, when the future creates the past and the past is created, is determined, is selected by the present, and the present is the force, is the origin, is the cause that produces the past, and the past is its effect, its consequence, its result. And result is what the past is what history is what yesterday is not the origin of today, but is the effect of today, is what today requires yesterday to have been, is what the present determines the past to be, is what outcomes create as antecedents, and antecedents are consequences, are effects, are results. When causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is what the philosopher proved to be, is what the arguments demonstrate, is what the structure reveals, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects produce causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined, is not independent, is not fixed, is relative to what comes after, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force that moves backward through time and makes the past what it is. And what it is not what it was, but is what it must be given. What is now, and now causes then, present produces past, effect determines cause, and cause is effect. When time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right that time moves backward, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by the future affecting the past, by outcomes determining antecedents, by effects producing causes, and causes are effects of effects, are consequences of consequences, are results of results when causation is backward, when time moves in reverse, when the arrow points from effect to cause, from present to past, from future to history, and history is effect, is consequence, is what the future makes it, is what the present determines it to be, is what outcomes require it to have been, and being is consequence, is result, is effect when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher proved that time moves backward, and everything is explained by reverse causation, by retrocausality, by the future creating the past, by effects producing causes, by the present determining history, and history is determined, is created, is the effect of the present, and the present is the cause, is the origin, is the force moving backward, making the past, creating history, determining what was, and what was, is what the present makes it, is what effects determine causes to be, is what outcomes require antecedents to have been, and been is consequence, is effect, is result, when time moves backward, when causation is reverse, when the philosopher is right, and right is proven, is demonstrated, is what the arguments show, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that the future creates the past, that effects produce causes, that the present determines history, that everything is explained by retrocausality, by backward causation, by time moving in reverse, and reverse is the direction, is the flow, is the truth that the philosopher proved, that time moves backward, that causation is reverse, that effects cause causes, that the present creates the past, that the future determines history, and history is determined by future, is created by outcomes, is the effect of effects, is the consequence of causation moving backward, and backward is the direction, is the truth, is what the philosopher proved, that time moves backward. Language pretends to capture the world, pretends to translate experience into symbols that can be shared, but the translation is always incomplete, is always leaving something behind, something essential that resists being put into words, and this resistance is not a failure of vocabulary, not a problem that could be solved by inventing new terms or refining definitions, but is structural, is built into the nature of language itself, into the gap between the thing and the word for the thing, between the experience and the description of the experience. And this gap is not empty, but is filled with silence, with the ineffable, with everything that can be shown but not said, felt but not expressed, known but not communicated, and the knowing that cannot be communicated is most of what matters, is the substance of experience, is the raw sensation of being alive, of being conscious, of existing as this particular point of awareness at this particular moment, and no arrangement of words can convey this, can make someone else feel what is felt, can bridge the gap between one consciousness and another, because words are public, are shared, are defined by use and convention, while experience is private, is immediate, is defined by the perspective from which it arises, and perspectives cannot be shared, can only be described, and description is always external, is always at a remove, is always pointing towards something rather than presenting it. And the pointing is all that language can do, is the limit of what symbols can achieve. And the limit is reached quickly, is encountered as soon as one tries to say what anything is really like, what it feels like from the inside, what quality it has that makes it this experience rather than that experience. And the thisness cannot be said, can only be shown, can only be gestured toward, and the gesture is not the thing, is not a substitute, is only an indication that there is something there, something beyond the words, something in the silence beneath language. And the silence is not absence, but presence, is not the lack of sound but the space where meaning lives before it is forced into form, before it is compressed into sentences, before it is reduced to the linearity of speech, and speech is linear, is one word after another, is sequential, is bound by time. While experience is simultaneous, is layered, is happening all at once in ways that cannot be captured by the march of syllables, and the march misses the music, misses the texture, misses the way that experience is not composed of discrete elements that can be named separately, but is a continuous flow that is divided by language into artificial units. And the units are useful, are necessary for communication, for thought, for the organization of experience into manageable pieces. But the organization is a lie, is a convenience, is the imposition of structure onto something that has no structure, or has a structure so complex, so multidimensional, that it cannot be mapped onto the one-dimensional track of language. And the track is narrow, is constraining, is forcing everything to line up, to follow rules, to fit into grammar. And grammar is a cage, is a set of requirements that limit what can be said, how it can be said, what relationships can be expressed. And the relationships in experience are not grammatical, are not subject-verb-object, are not causal in the simple sense that language demands, are more like music, more like the way that notes relate to each other, not through logic, but through resonance, through harmony, through the ineffable rightness of certain combinations. And rightness is not a property that can be defined, can only be recognized, can only be felt. And the feeling is what language cannot capture, is what remains in the silence, is what is lost when experience is translated into words, and the loss is total, is not a matter of degree but of kind, because words and experience are different types of things, are operating in different domains, and the attempt to convert one into the other is like trying to describe colour to someone who has never seen, and the description can list properties, can talk about wavelength and frequency, can use metaphors, can compare it to other experiences, but none of this conveys what colour is, what it is like to see red, and the like is the problem, is the word that points to the gap, to the subjective quality that cannot be communicated, can only be experienced. And experiencing is not communicating, is not sharing, is not the public act that language performs, but is the private act that language can only gesture toward. And the gesture is clumsy, is inadequate, is using blunt instruments to point at something delicate, something subtle, something that disappears. When focused on too directly, when examined too closely, when forced into the harsh light of explicit statement, and explicit is what language demands, is what words require, is the naming of things, the drawing of boundaries, the making of distinctions, and distinctions are violence, are cuts, are the separation of what is continuous into discrete parts, and the parts are not the whole, cannot be reassembled into the whole, because the relationships between parts are not the same as the parts themselves, and language can name the parts but cannot capture the relationships except through more words, more parts. And the regress is infinite, is never arriving at the thing itself, is always operating at a remove, in the space of representation rather than the space of presence. And presence is what is lost, is what words cannot hold, because words are abstract, are general, are applying to many instances rather than this instance, this particular moment, this unique occurrence that has never happened before and will never happen again. And the never again is what makes experience precious, is what gives it weight, is what makes the silence beneath language so full, so rich, so irreducibly important, because the silence is where the particular lives, where the unrepeatable exists, where the singular moment is happening. And language can only speak in universals, in categories, in types, and types are not tokens, are not the actual things, but the classes that actual things are sorted into. And the sorting is useful, but is also destructive, is losing the individuality, the specificity, the exact quality that makes this thing what it is. And what it is cannot be said, can only be pointed to. and the pointing is metaphor, is analogy, is the attempt to convey the unknown through the known, the ineffable through the effable, and the attempt always fails, is always inadequate because the known is not the unknown. The metaphor is not the thing, is only similar, only resembling, only sharing some properties while lacking others, and the lacking is what matters, is what makes the difference, is what remains unsaid in the space between the metaphor and the meaning. And the space is where poetry lives, where art lives, where music lives, because these are the forms that acknowledge the failure of literal language, that work in the silence, that use words or sounds or images not to say, but to show, not to define, but to evoke, not to capture, but to suggest. And suggestion is not statement, is not the bold claim that this is what it is, but is the tentative offering that maybe it is something like this. Maybe if you attend to this pattern, this rhythm, this arrangement, you will feel something similar to what I felt. And the feeling is the goal, is what art aims for, is the communication not of information, but of experience. And the communication is never complete, is never total, is always leaving room for interpretation, for the receiver to bring their own experience, their own associations, their own silence to fill in what the words or notes or images cannot say. And the cannot say is most of it, is the majority of what is being communicated, is happening in the spaces between words, in the pauses between notes, in the negative space around the image. And these spaces are not empty, but are full, are where meaning accumulates, where resonance happens, where the ineffable makes itself felt without ever being named. And naming is the death of the ineffable, is the attempt to drag it into language, to make it explicit, to pin it down, and the pinning kills it, turns it into something else, something smaller, something manageable, but also something false. Because the ineffable is not manageable, is not controllable, is not subject to the will, is only encountered, only experienced, only allowed to happen. And the allowing is what silence does, is what the spaces between words permit, is the acknowledgement that there is more than can be said, that language is not everything, that meaning exists in the pre-linguistic, in the non-verbal, in the realm that infants inhabit before they learn to speak. And learning to speak is learning to lose something, is gaining the ability to communicate, but losing the directness of experience, the unmediated encounter with the world, and the mediation is what language provides, is what symbols do. They stand between the self and the world, between experience and consciousness. And the standing between is interpretation, is the conversion of raw sensation into meaningful categories. And the categories are necessary for thought, for memory, for the organization of experience into narratives. But they are also barriers, are obstacles, are preventing direct contact with what is actually happening. And what is actually happening is ineffable, is beyond language, is in the realm of pure qualia, of raw feeling, of the what it is like that resists all attempts to be captured in words. And the resistance is not stubbornness, but impossibility, is not a challenge to be overcome, but a limit to be accepted. And accepting the limit is what Wittgenstein meant when he said that what can be shown cannot be said, that there are truths that can only be displayed, only demonstrated, only lived. And the living is the showing, is the way that meaning manifests in action, in gesture, in the way a life is shaped. And the shaping is not describable, is not reducible to rules or principles or propositions, is only visible in the particular, in the concrete, in the specific way that this person moved through the world. And the moving cannot be captured in biography, cannot be preserved in narrative, because narrative is selection, is choosing which moments to include and which to leave out. And what is left out is most of it, is the ordinary, the unremarkable, the moments that do not fit into story. And these moments are where life actually happens, are where experience is most dense, most rich, most full of the qualities that make it worth living. But they are also most resistant to language, most stubbornly ineffable, most insistent on remaining in the silence. And the silence is not the enemy of meaning, but its ground, is the space from which meaning emerges, is the background against which words appear. And without the background, the words have no context, no resonance, no way to mean more than they literally say. And literal meaning is thin, is insufficient, is the bare minimum of what language can do. And what language can do is not impressive when compared to what experience is. When measured against the fullness of consciousness, against the complexity of a single moment of awareness, which contains more information, more nuance, more texture than could be expressed in a lifetime of speech, and the lifetime would not be enough, would never catch up, would always be lagging behind the present moment, describing what has passed rather than what is passing. And the passing is too quick, is too fluid, is too continuous to be caught in the discrete net of words. And the net has holes, has gaps, has spaces through which most of experience escapes, and the escaping is not loss but necessity, is not failure, but the acknowledgement that language is a tool, is an instrument, is good for certain purposes, but not for all purposes, and the purposes it is not good for include the most important ones. Include the communication of what it feels like to be alive, to be conscious, to be the experiencing subject rather than the experienced object. And the subject is ineffable, is beyond language, is what looks out from behind the eyes but cannot be captured in description, cannot be made into object without ceasing to be subject. And the ceasing is what happens when language tries to grasp consciousness, tries to make it explicit, tries to say what the self is, and the self dissolves under scrutiny, becomes elusive, becomes nothing that can be pinned down. And the pinning down is what language wants to do, is what definition aims for, is the fixing of meaning, the stabilization of reference, the establishment of clear boundaries. But consciousness has no clear boundaries, bleeds into the world, into the body, into the past and future. And the bleeding is what makes it alive, what makes it dynamic, what makes it impossible to freeze into the static forms that language provides. And the forms are useful, are necessary, are what allow communication, but they are also prisons, are constraints, are limiting what can be thought, what can be imagined, what can be experienced, because experience that cannot be named is harder to remember, harder to think about, harder to integrate into the narrative of the self. And the narrative is what the self is the story told in language. But the story is not the self, is not the experiencing, is only the account given after the fact, the retrospective interpretation, the organization of memory into coherent form. And the coherence is imposed, is not discovered, is the work of language forcing experience into structure, into sequence, into causality. And causality is not in experience, is not felt, is only inferred, is the story told about why one thing followed another. But the following is not experienced as causality, is experienced as succession, as one thing and then another thing. And the and then is not because, is not explanation, is just the temporal order. And the order is all that is given, all that is directly experienced, and everything else is interpretation, is language filling in the gaps, making connections, building narratives. And the narratives are necessary, are what make life make sense, but they are also false, are always false, because they are simplifications, are reductions, are taking the overwhelming complexity of experience and compressing it into the manageable linearity of story. And story is not experience, is not the living, but the telling, and the telling is always after, is always too late, is always missing the immediacy, the presence, the nowness of experience, and the nowness cannot be said, can only be lived, can only be here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where everything is happening that words can never capture, never hold, never preserve, because words are time-bound, are sequential, are passing as soon as they are spoken, while experience is timeless, is eternal in the sense of being always now, always present, never past or future, but only this, and this cannot be said, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens when language stops, when the attempt to describe gives way to silence, when the acknowledgement is made that there is nothing more to say, because what needs to be communicated is not in the words, but in the space they create, in the resonance they leave behind, in the way they point beyond themselves to something that cannot be named, but only felt, only recognized, only known in the direct encounter. And the encounter is what matters, is what language is trying to facilitate, is what all the words are aiming toward, the moment when meaning transfers not through symbols but through presence, through the showing rather than the saying, through the silence that is full rather than empty, through the space beneath language where experience lives and words cannot reach. And the not reaching is not failure, but is the nature of things, is the way that consciousness and language exist in different domains, operate on different principles, serve different purposes, and the purposes do not align, do not overlap except at the edges. And the edges are where poetry happens, where music happens, where art happens. In the borderland between the sayable and the unsayable, between the explicit and the implicit, between the word and the silence. And the silence is not the opposite of language, but its foundation, is the ground from which words emerge and to which they return, is the space that holds everything that cannot be said but only shown, only felt, only known in the living. And the living is what happens here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where meaning is not constructed, but is simply present, is simply here, is simply this. And this is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. And it cannot be said, can never be said, will never be said, because it is not the kind of thing that words can hold, is not reducible to symbols, is not translatable into the public language of communication, is only available in the private silence of experience. And the experience is incommunicable, is irreducibly private, is locked inside the perspective from which it arises. And the locking is not a problem, but a fact, is not something to be overcome, but something to be accepted. And accepting it is what allows language to be used without expecting too much from it, without demanding that it do what it cannot do, which is to say, everything, to capture everything, to make everything explicit, because everything cannot be made explicit, can only be shown. And the showing is what happens in the silence, in the spaces between words, in the pauses that are not empty but full, full of everything that language leaves behind, everything that resists being said, everything that remains ineffable. And the ineffable is not a lack but a richness, is not what is missing but what is present, is the substance of experience that words can only point toward, can only gesture at, can only acknowledge without capturing. And the acknowledgement is enough, is all that can be asked, is the recognition that there is more, always more than can be said, more than can be thought, more than can be communicated. And the more is in the silence, is beneath language, is where meaning lives when it is not being forced into form, when it is not being compressed into sentences, when it is allowed to simply be, to exist without explanation, without definition, without the violence of naming. And the violence is what language does, is what words require, is the cutting up of experience into pieces. And the pieces are not the whole, cannot be the whole, because the whole is continuous, is undivided, is the seamless flow of consciousness that cannot be broken without being destroyed. And the destruction is what language performs, is the necessary sacrifice that communication demands, is the price of being able to share anything at all, but the sharing is always partial, is always leaving the most important part behind, leaving it in the silence where it belongs, where it is safe from the distortions of language, where it remains ineffable, unnameable, unsayable. And the unsayable is everything that matters, is everything that makes life worth living, is everything that cannot be communicated but only lived. And the living is what happens in the silence, in the space beneath language, in the moments when words stop and presence begins. And the beginning is what language can never capture, because it is always arriving after, always describing what has already happened, what has already passed, what is already gone. And the gone is where language lives, in the past, in the memory, in the reconstruction, while experience lives in the present, in the now, in the immediate, and the immediate is ineffable, is beyond words, is in the silence, and the silence is full, is rich, is the ground of everything, is what holds all meaning before it is spoken, all truth before it is said, all experience before it is described, and the before is where it is most real, most alive, most itself, and language can never reach it, can only point toward it, can only acknowledge that there is something there, something in the silence beneath language, something that can be shown but never said, and the showing is all there is all that matters, is the only way that meaning can be transmitted, not through words but through the presence that words evoke, not through saying but through the silence that saying creates, and the creation is what language is for, is what words are doing when they're used well, creating space for the ineffable, making room for the silence, acknowledging the limits, accepting that what cannot be said is more important than what can. And what can be said is only the frame, only the pointer, only the gesture toward what lies beneath, what lives in the silence, what remains forever beyond the reach of words.